These World War I trenches shouldn't exist. The parapet of this trench is the exact border between two countries. 3 armies met up here, 2 at war, in an area that should become one of the most unreal theatres of World War I. Up here, all belligerents had the same deadly enemy. The exact point the Alpine Front started. This is one of the strangest places of World War I. These trenches were built by an army that never came here to fight. So, why were they here? So, as you can see, these trenches were built basically as a drywall. There's no cement, no mortar, no concrete, just rocks. And here's even the boundary stone, and you can see where the trench and you can see where the trench runs along this ridge, and this exact ridge is forming an international border. Most people imagine World War I as mud, trenches and barbed wire in France and Belgium, but around here the war climbed up these very mountains you can see all around here. All these mountains are more or less 3,000 meters high, and they were heavily contested, and pretty bloody battles broke out just in this very picturesque and beautiful corner of Europe. Following down this former trench, and here you can beautifully see some sort of compartments that were built with rocks. So maybe here they stored the ammo crates, maybe food, stuff like that. And here, this wall actually was the parapet of the trench, so to say. And you can see over there, it continues. And there's even the next boundary stone. So we really are on the border here. But why exactly were these trenches built here? As you probably know, Italy was on the side with Germany and Austro-Hungary until May 1915, because on May 23rd, 1915, Italy declared war on Austro-Hungary. They, pretty much wanted to expand north towards South Tyrol, towards nowadays Slovenia. So that was basically and pretty simplified the reason why the Alpine Front even formed. The Alpine Front that you most certainly know of the famous battles at, for example, Monte Grappa in Italy, or the famous Dolomite battles at Lagazuoi. The whole Alpine Front stretched over 600 kilometers, and actually this area here was the westernmost point of the Alpine Front, or so to say, the exact point the Alpine Front started. From here, ran through Italy, through Slovenia, to all these places like Kilometer in western Slovenia, and along all the famous peaks, as I said, Monte Grappa, Lagazuoi, and so on. Actually, you can imagine the front line stretching from here all the way to the Adriatic, in the area of what is nowadays known as Koper in Slovenia. Just to give you a little hint where we are right now, this mountain peak behind me is Piz Umbrail, which forms the border between Switzerland and Italy. This front line wasn't just one mountain. This area here was one small section of Alpine Front stretching hundreds of kilometers. Here we have a closer look. Boundary stone. S for Switzerland and I for Italy. These trenches here were Swiss trenches forming the exact border with Italy. The Italian positions weren't too far off. They had their trenches just nearby. Well, the frontline trenches. But the Italian fortifications were all over these mountains over there. They are all full with trenches. And right there you can see the Stelvio, or in Italian, Passo di Stelvio. And right on this little peak, that's the so-called Dreisprachenspitze, the three-language peak, which back then formed the border of Switzerland, Austro-Hungary, and Italy. Most soldiers that were stationed here in these mountain peaks, they didn't die from bullets, grenades, or shrapnel. Not at all. They died of frostbite, avalanches, bitter cold, because the weather really was the biggest enemy up here. So, you might ask yourself, why exactly this mountain pass? Why did all unfold here? Because the Stelvio Pass, as well as the Umbrail Pass road just down the valley here, are two of the most important mountain passes in this area between Lombardy in Italy and Tyrol or Switzerland. And up here in the mountains, especially during the mountain wars, the doctrine was quite simple. Whoever controls the peaks controls who passes or who doesn't. So when Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, that did change the situation for the Swiss, drastically, because until that point, the Swiss had thought, well, nothing's going to happen for sure, so there's no need to fortify these mountains up here. But from May 1915 onwards, there was the imminent threat of Italy trying to cross Switzerland to invade South Tyrol, maybe through these very Swiss valleys. So, Swiss army pretty hastily, so to say, stormed forward to fortify these mountains and to make clear that no army is gonna pass through a neutral country. Look at that. Even stepping board remains this trench. This shows perfectly that this trench sits exactly on the border, so the Swiss army would have had pretty good view on the Italians as well as on the Austro-Hungarian troops that were stationed up there on the Stelvio, because as you probably all know, before the annexation of South Tyrol, that was a part of Austria-Hungary until the Italians could take it with the help of the British, of course. So nowadays, South Tyrol over there belongs to Italy, even though it still has a significant German-speaking population. Yeah, it must have been not a shelter like wooden hut, located exactly on the trench. Here you can beautifully see Piz Umbrail. Up there, there's the cross. So the ridge down here has always been the border between Italy and Switzerland. Now the border is still running along this ridge. You can even see where the trenches once ran along. Here's another one. Let's check it out. Interesting to know might be that Swiss army had already been mobilized in August 1914, and they were given the task to secure all the borders. So they certainly were stationed here as well, but these trenches weren't built back then. They were built most certainly in summer 1915. Look at how beautiful this trench was bricked. Drywall technique, because they wanted to save every bit of resources, so they didn't even dare to hoist mortar or concrete up these mountains. And from that point on, where the Swiss started fortifying this border area. Of course, the Italians did so too, and they basically stared each other dead in the eye, even though there are many confirmed accounts of, how should I say, fraternization between Swiss and Italian soldiers, as well as, funnily enough, Swiss and Austro-Hungarian soldiers. So they traded chocolate for tobacco and so on. So even though the situation was serious, well, soldiers are gonna be soldiers. You might be asking, what was the daily life for the soldiers up here like? Well, it was like anywhere else on the front lines, whether it was the Western Front in France or here. During the day, around here the soldiers were doing maintenance in the trenches and barracks. Maybe playing games, cooking, doing all the things ordinary soldiers do in their spare time. And of course they were watching. They were watching the Italians. They were watching the Austro-Hungarians, because the most important thing for the Swiss was maintaining neutrality at all cost. That was the doctrine of the commanding general Ulrich Wille, and he made that pretty clear. We have reached the trench section again, and we'll use this opportunity to have a look. On the Italian side, you can see the road winding up the hill, and just over there you can barely see the Italian trenches. Maybe they had some sort of observation post up there, maybe armed with a machine gun or a mortar, but that was it. Maybe you can hear it, not anymore, but always quite windy up here. And just imagine being up here in winter conditions. Usually this area of the Alps in winter it can get below minus 30 degrees Celsius, 2 to 3 meters of snow, and all of that combined with strong winds. So that isn't the prettiest thought, to be honest. Now still, what might look like some random arrangement of rocks once was a trench, and it's quite typical for Swiss trenches to have every now and then this curved, reinforced part. I don't even know how to call it in English. You can see it beautifully here, down there, over there. That's the consistency that you can see in every Swiss World War I trench. The rocks here are actually pretty soft, it's quite slippery. Look, here you could have stepped on. Of course, the rest of this section has already eroded by 100 years. Weather. Now we're going to be following this very trench. If you look at this unreal rough place here, how about logistics? Well, Swiss Army pioneers, they built some tracks up these mountains towards the front line, because without logistics, you don't have any supply. And without a supply, you can't sustain a fighting army, or at least an army that should be prepared to secure the border. Now let's try to get down here. There's one similarity with the Vosges front, because the Swiss has, how should I say, as mountain people, they of course also built cableway systems to bring up heavy material such as ammunition and construction material. So, we've reached some rather beautiful preserved section of trench. And right there, where this fence post is, there's the border. The Swiss did it the same way as any other army. In front of their trenches, they would have placed barbed wire entanglement. So pretty much the basic World War I stuff, so to say. Now we're finally able to walk the trenches. Beautiful. And maybe you've already realized it. We do have some parallels here with Kilometer Zero, because why am I filming World War I trenches in Switzerland? Well, the Alpine Front actually started here, as I already said. Now look at that. Even the stepping board how it's called again, still remaining. Here you can see how beautifully this trench has been bricked just by just using natural rock. So it's quite obvious why professional bricklayers were pretty much sought after on these front lines. Amazing. Still some remains of wood. The original wood, I'm assuming. Wire. It's always quite interesting filming in Swiss World War One spots, because you might think Switzerland more or less is irrelevant in the context of World War One, but was it really? Well, hadn't the Swiss fortified their border, maybe the outcome of World War One would have been much different. Who knows? Oh, look at this. It's just beautiful what remains after 100 years. You can clearly see the parallels with, for example, German or French World War One trenches. Even though these were different nations, but they all more or less used the same techniques when it was about building trenches. Simplicity and practicality. That was it. Something that becomes pretty obvious up here. This is the Swiss frontline trench, and over there was already the second line, even though not as heavily fortified, but still the Swiss also worked with a frontline trench, second and the third line, which is pretty interesting to see. Ammo storage? Most certainly. So just for reference, the border running along the fence there. And the Swiss frontline trench pretty much makes that curve. Ja, was alles gut. Ja, alles gut. Niet doen faken. And here, the typical zigzag pattern starting to become quite obvious. So we started right there, walking down along the border trench, so to say. We didn't go all the way up to Pits Umbrail. This structure here that might feel like an ordinary drywall actually was a mountain road, or rather a hiking path, especially built for mules. You can see how it's winding down there. And Swiss engineers specifically built these makeshift reinforced mountain roads so they could transport ammunition, construction material, food, and so on by mules and of course by hand. And a similar thing, I don't know if we can see it on video, over there. You can see the zigzags going up that hill. It's actually the same sort of structure. Just imagine building such a road up these steep mountains for the sole purpose of bringing up material. We're going to be following the Swiss trench here. And just regarding this very sector, it must have been around here where, even against all the orders, the Swiss and Italian soldiers traded goods and even joked about their situation, their predicament, most certainly, because many of the Italians that had to serve in the Italian army that was stationed here, they were from the valleys back there, and most certainly they even had worked in Switzerland, so they knew the culture, they knew how to talk to the... It's a pretty sad thing if you think about. Now that we're having pretty good view on the pass road, by the way, down here, there's the old border building, and here's the boundary stone, so we're right on the border. But standing here, what was the tactic or the strategic thinking behind positioning trenches right here? Because an attack would have occurred on the pass road, certainly. Well, that's true. But these very trenches were positioned up here, so to slow an approaching enemy down as much as possible and to make an advance on Swiss territory as uncomfortable as possible. And that was, even back then in World War I, that was the Swiss redoubt strategy, the same one as in World War II. Just in World War II, they adapted it to the time. But still, back in World War I, they even had a redoubt strategy. Here you can see the boundary stone, and here was once again Swiss shelter, just embodied into the trench system. And just to show you something, the fence here still marks the border, and over here there's already an Italian position and Italian trench. So they were basically sitting on each other. What we're looking at here is what remains of an officer's quarter called the paper mill by the soldiers. And why paper mill, you might ask? Well, this was the place where the daily orders were written for that whole sector here, or where they would have handled vacation requests. So a lot of bureaucracy happened here. And basically what you're seeing here is what remains of the foundation. So there would have been sort of like a wooden superstructure, of course underlaid with stones, but still an officer's office in such an unreal place. And along the hiking trail here is still the remains of, how should I call it? For the sake of simplicity, I'm just gonna call it Military Road. You can see it's running up here to the foundation of the building that once stood up there. Let's have a look. So this building here was called Barbara Hut, named after Saint Barbara, which was the saint of the miners and of the artillery. Even though up here there wasn't any artillery stationed, but the name was given by the miners who were in these units serving here. You can even see the rest of, I don't know, corrugated iron, or once something like a pipe. Here you can still beautifully see in this corner supposedly the original wood. Beautiful. There's even a tin, but it could also be much younger than from World War I. And this hut here actually was a troop barrack for up to, I don't know, 20 men, something like that. They even had, you can see it here, some flat ground, maybe for exercising or whatnot. And just below us, over there, there's the paper mill. Such a rough terrain here. Now we're following this trench along the border, downhill. And here you can see it once more. The Swiss trench, the Swiss parapet, and over there, the Italian position. You can even see, probably you can see the Italian trench system supposedly running along there. And this house, the right wall, is the border of Switzerland and Italy. From a distance, you would think this might be just a random accumulation of rocks. But no, it isn't. It's a weathered trench. And walking downhill, it even appears a little bit more massive than it did all up the mountain. And here once again, maybe it's a little bit easier to spot, but this whole area over there is full with trenches. Even the ridge up there was fully entrenched by the Italians, because, as I said, over there, this exact spot marked the border between Italy, Austro-Hungary, and Switzerland. And we should also appreciate nature a little bit. That's Alpine juniper for everyone that loves to have a sip of gin, for example. Now, as we're walking through this trench, something worth remembering: the Western Front battlefields were fought over meters of advance, while up here on the Alpine Front, it was a war of altitude. Whoever controlled the high peaks controlled what happened underneath. As we're walking through Swiss trenches up here, they more or less were in a comfortable position. Their only task, so to say, was to secure the border. But if you think of the battles that were fought between Italy and Austria-Hungary, for example, the battles at Asiago, which I'll link just up here. These were massive battles in rough terrain. Or if you think about the Alpine fronts at, for example, La Gazois, at nearly 4,000 meters altitude, and heavy snow, wind, hail, where hundreds of soldiers died of cold and from avalanches. Even now, when even now amplified by climate change, when glaciers are melting, they expose World War I soldiers that once died there. So it's something completely different. And also to make a connection to my Verdun video, where I asked the question, was Verdun the worst battle? If you think of this environment fighting up here, this adds a whole new level of harshness to these battles that took place up here. Now back down at the pass road, you can see over there the Italian trench running in that direction. So, standing at the parapet of a former Swiss trench on the border, thinking about what happened here, well, it is how history sometimes plays. I really hope that you've learned something new. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If so, please let me know down below in the comments. A like and or your subscription to my small channel would mean the world to me. And see you guys. Have a wonderful week. Bye.